Hi everyone, welcome back to Pages of the Globe. Today I'm going to be reading to you the short story, The Mockingbird by Ambrose Bierce. Before we start, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the author and then we're going to jump straight into the story. So, Ambrose Bierce was born on June 24th, 1842, and he was an American short story writer, journalist, poet, and American Civil War veteran. His book, The Devil's Dictionary, was named one of the 100 greatest masterpieces of American literature by the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration, and his story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, has been described as one of the most famous and frequently anthologized stories in American literature. And his book, Tales and Soldiers of Civilians, also published in The Midst of Life, was named by the Royal Club one of the 100 most influential American books printed before 1900. Even the story that we will be reading today, The Mockingbird, details a very similar, it's about something that happened during the Civil War, which, as I said before, Ambrose Bierce was actually a veteran of. Now, for his legacy and influence, he has left a huge one. Ambrose Bierce has been fictionalized in more than 500 novels, short stories, movies, and television shows, and stage plays and comics books. Most of these works draw upon Bierce's vivid personality, colorful wit, relationships with famous people such as Jack London and William Randolph Hearst, or quite frequently, his mysterious disappearance. That's right, something very interesting about Ambrose Bierce was that at the age of 71, he departed from Washington, D.C. for a tour of his old Civil War battlefield, and according to some reports, by December he had passed through Louisiana and Texas, crossing by way of El Paso into Mexico, which was at the time in throes of a revolution, because this was happening in October of 1913. In Ciudad Juarez, or the city of Juarez, he joined Pancho Villa's army as an observer, and in that role he witnessed the Battle of Tierra Blanca. It is reported that Bierce accompanied Villa's army as far as the city of Chihuahua, and there his last known communication with the world was a letter he wrote to Blanche Partington, a close friend, dated December 26, 1913. After closing this letter by saying, "As for me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination," and he vanished without a trace, which is now one of the most famous disappearances in American literary history. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like to read next. I love reading stories that you guys want me to read, and remember to comment about this story or any other story down below too, so we can just talk about our opinions. The Mockingbird by Ambrose Bierce. The time a pleasant Sunday afternoon in the early autumn of 1861. The place a Forest Heart in the mountain region of northwestern Virginia. Private Grayrock of the Federal Army is discovered seated comfortably at the root of a great pine tree, against which he leans, his legs extended right along the ground, his rifle lying across his thighs, his hands clasped in the order that they may not fall away to his sides, resting upon the barrel of the weapon. The contact on the back of his head with the tree has pushed his cap downward over his eyes, almost concealing them. One seeing him would say that he has slept. Private Grayrock did not sleep. To have done so would have imperiled the interests of the United States, for he was a long way outside the lines and subject to capture or death at the hands of the enemy. Moreover, he was in a frame of mind unfavorable to repose. The cause of his perturbation of spirit was this. During the previous night he had served on the picket guard and had been posted as a sentinel in this very forest. The night was clear, though moonless, but in the gloom of the wood the darkness was deep. Grayrock's post was at a considerable distance from those to the right and left, for the pickets had been thrown out a needless distance from the camp, making the line too long for the force detailed to occupy it. The war was young, and military camps entertained the error that while sleeping they were better protected by thin lines a long way out toward the enemy than thicker ones close in. And surely they needed as long notice as possible of an enemy's approach, for they were at that time addicted to the practice of undressing, than which nothing could be more unsoldierly. On the morning of the memorable 6th of April at Shiloh, many of Grant's men, when spitted on, Confederate bayonets were naked as civilians, but it should be allowed that this was not because of any defect in their picket line. Their error was of another sort. They had no pickets. This is perhaps a vain digression. I should not care to undertake to interest the reader in the fate of an army. What we have here to consider is that of Private Grayrock. For 2 hours after he had been left at his lonely post that Saturday night, he stood shock-still, leaning against the trunk of a large tree, staring into the darkness in his front, and trying to recognize known objects, for he had been posted at the same spot during the day. But all was now different. He saw nothing in detail, but only groups of things, whose shapes, not observed when there was something more of them to observe, were now unfamiliar. They seemed not to have been there before. A landscape that is all trees and undergrowth, moreover, lacks definition, is confused and without accentuated points upon which attention can gain a foothold. Add the gloom of the moonless night, and something more than great natural intelligence and a city education is required to preserve one's knowledge of direction. And that is how it occurred to that Private Grayrock, after vigilantly watching the spaces in his front and then imprudently executing a circumspection of his whole dimly visible environment, silently walking around his tree to accomplish it, lost his bearings and seriously impaired his usefulness as a sentinel. Lost at his post, unable to say in which direction to look for an enemy's approach and in which way lay the sleeping camp for whose security he was accountable with his life, conscious too of many another awkward feature of the situation and considerations affecting his own safety, Private Grayrock was profoundly disquieted. Nor was he given time to recover his tranquillity, for almost at the moment he realized his awkward predicament, he heard a stir of leaves and a snap of fallen twigs, and turning with a stilled heart in the direction whence it came, saw in the gloom the indistinct outlines of a human figure. "Halt!" shouted Private Grayrock, peremptorily, as in duty bound, backing up the command with the sharp metallic snap of his cocking rifle. "Who goes there?" There was no answer. At least, there was an instant's hesitation, and the answer, if it came, was lost in the report of the sentinel's rifle. In the silence of the night and the forest, the sound was deafening, and hardly had it died away when it was repeated by the pieces of the pickets right to left, a sympathetic fusillade. For 2 hours, every unconverted civilian of them had been evolving enemies from his imagination and peopling the woods in front of him. And Grayrock's shot had started the whole encroaching host into visible existence. Having fired, all retreated breathless to the reserves, all but Grayrock, who did not know in which direction to retreat. When no enemy appearing, the roused camp 2 miles away had undressed and got itself into bed again, and the picket line was cautiously re-established, and he was discovered bravely holding his ground, and was complimented by the officer of the guard as the one soldier of that devoted band who could rightly be considered the moral equivalent of that uncommon unit of value, a whoop in hell. In the meantime, however, Grayrock had made a close but unavailing search for the mortal part of the intruder, at whom he had fired, and whom he had a marksman's intuitive sense of having hit, for he was one of those born experts who shot without aim by an instinctive sense of direction, and are nearly as dangerous by night as by day. During a full half of his 24 years, he had been a terror to the targets of all the shooting galleries in 3 cities. Unable now to produce his dead game, he had the discretion to hold his tongue, and was glad to observe in his officer and comrades the natural assumption that by not having run away he had seen nothing hostile. His honorable mention had been earned by not running away anyhow. Nevertheless, Private Grayrock was far from satisfied with the night's adventure, and when the next day he made some fair enough pretext to apply for a pass to go outside the lines, and the general commanding promptly granted it in recognition of his bravery the night before, he passed out at the point where that had been displayed, telling the sentinel then on duty that he had lost something, which was true. He renewed the search for the person whom he supposed himself to have shot, and whom, if only wounded, he hoped to trail by the blood. He was no more successful by daylight than he had been in the darkness, and after covering a wide area and boldly penetrating a long distance into the Confederacy, he gave up the search. Somewhat fatigued, seated himself at the root of the great pine tree where we had seen him, and indulged in his disappointment. It is not to be inferred that Greyrock's was the chagrin of a cruel nature balked by its bloody deed. In the clear, large eyes, finely wrought lips, and broad forehead of that young man one could read quite another story, and in point of fact, his character was singularly felicitous, compound of boldness and sensibility, courage and conscience. "I find myself disappointed," he said to himself, sitting there at the bottom of the golden haze submerging the forest like a subtler sea. "Disappointed in failing to discover a fellow man dead by my hand. Do I then really wish that I had taken life in the performance of a duty as well performed without? What more could I wish? If any danger threatened, my shot averted it. That is what I was there to do. No, I am glad indeed if no human life was needlessly extinguished by me. But I am in a false position. I have suffered myself to be complimented by my officers and envied by my comrades. The camp is ringing with praise of my courage. That is not just. I know myself courageous, but this praise for specific acts which I did not perform or performed otherwise, it is believed that I remained at my post bravely without firing, whereas it was I who began the fusillade, and I did not retreat in the general alarm because bewildered. What then shall I do? Explain that I saw an enemy and fired? They have all said that themselves, yet none believes it. Shall I tell us truth which, discrediting my courage, will have an effect of a lie? Ugh, it is an ugly business altogether. I wish to God I could find my man." And so wishing, Private Greyrock, overcome at last by the languor of the afternoon, and lulled by the stilly sounds of insects droning and proposing in certain fragrant shrubs, so far forgot the interests of the United States as to fall asleep and expose himself to capture. And sleeping, he dreamed. He thought of himself as a boy, living in a far, fair land by the border of a great river upon which the tall steamboats moved grandly up and down beneath their towering evolutions of black smoke, which announced them long before they had rounded the bends and marked their movements when miles out of sight. With him always at his side as he watched them was one to whom he gave his heart and soul in love, a twin brother. Together they strolled along the banks of the stream, together explored the fields lying farther away from it, and gathered pungent mints and stakes of fragrant sassafras in the hills overlooking all, beyond which lay the realm of conjecture, and from which, looking southward across the great river, they caught glimpses of the enchanted land. Hand in hand and heart, they two, the only children of a widowed mother, walked in paths of the light through valleys of peace, seeing new things under the sun. And through all the golden days floated one unceasing sound, the rich, thrilling melody of a mockingbird in a cage by the cottage. The joyous bird was always in song. Its infinitely various notes seemed to flow through its throat, effortless. That fresh, clear melody seemed, indeed, the spirit of the scene, the meaning and interpretation, to sense the mysteries of life and love. But there came a time when the days of the dream grew dark with sorrow in a rain of tears. The good mother was dead, the meadow-side home by the great river was broken up, and the brothers were parted by two of their kinsmen. William, the dreamer, went to live in a populous city in the realm of conjecture, and John, crossing the river into the enchanted land, was taken to a distant region, whose people and their lives and ways were said to be strange and wicked. To him, in the distribution of the dead mother's estate, had fallen all that they deemed of value, the mockingbird. They could be divided, but it could not. So it was carried away into the strange country, and the world William knew of it no more forever. Yet through the after time of its loneliness, its song filled all the dream, and seemed always sounding in his ear and in his heart. The kinsmen who had adopted the boys were enemies, holding no communication. For a time, letters full of boyish bravado and boastful narratives of the new and larger experience, grotesque descriptions of their widening lives and the new worlds they had conquered passed between them, but these gradually became less frequent, and with William's removal to another and greater city, ceased altogether. But ever though it all rang the song of the mockingbird, and when the dreamer opened his eyes and stared through the vistas of the pine forest, the cessation of its music first apprised him that he was awoke. The sun was low and red in the west. The level rays projected from the trunk of each pine a wall shadow traversing the golden haze to eastward, until light and shade were blended in indistinguishable blue. Private Grayrock rose to his feet, looking cautiously about him, shouldered his rifle, and set off toward camp. He had gone perhaps a half a mile, and was passing a thicket of thorl, when a bird rose from the midst of it, perching on the branch of a tree above, pouring from its joyous breast so inexhaustible floods of song as but one of all God's creatures can utter in his praise. There was little in that. It was only to open the bill and breathe. Yet the man stopped, as if struck, stopped and let fall his rifle, looked up at the bird, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept like a child. For the moment he was indeed a child, in the spirit and in memory, dwelling again by the great river, over against the enchanted land. Then with an effort of will he pulled himself together, picked up his weapon, and oddly damning himself for an idiot, strode on. Passing an opening that reached into the heart of the little thicket, he looked in, and there, supine upon the earth, in arms all aboard, in its grey uniform, stained with a single spot of blood upon the breast, its white face turned sharply upward and backward, lay the image of himself, the body of John Grayrock, dead of a gunshot wound and still warm. He had found his man. As the unfortunate soldier knelt beside that masterwork of civil war, the shrilling bird upon the bough overhead stilled her song, and flushed with sunset crimson glory, glided silently away through the solemn spaces of the wood. At roll call that evening in the Federal camp, the name William Grayrock brought no response, nor ever again thereafter. The end. All right, so that was The Mockingbird by Ambrose Bierce. Just to recap really quick, it was released in 1891, and it was a short story by the American author Ambrose Bierce, who is also remembered for the witty Devil's Dictionary, and like I was talking about before, his mysterious disappearance around 1914. So, if you remember, The Mockingbird is a Civil War tale, which, interestingly enough, Ambrose Bierce was actually a veteran of the Civil War, which is why if you read a lot of his stories, you might see that he talks about it a lot just because he likes to take influence from his life stories, and most authors we read on this channel do that. But anyway, so this story is about a soldier who shoots a man while on sentry duty at night and struggles to find the man's body, only to make a shocking and grisly discovery the next day. So this story takes place on one Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1861, in the early months of the American Civil War. In Virginia, a man named Private Grayrock is keeping watch for the Federal Army. He's resting against a tree looking out for an enemy Confederate soldiers. It's a moonless night and it's super dark outside, and Grayrock soon loses his sense of direction. So he's walking around the tree trying to find some perspective on the area, but this just succeeds in causing him to, as he says, lose his remaining bearings. So just then, a man approaches, and Grayrock panics and opens fire without knowing if he's facing the enemy or his army camp. This shot leads to a shooting match between the two armies. After the shooting ceases, Grayrock goes in search of the man he shot at. He's a good marksman, and he instinctively knows that he hits the man, but he can't find him. Meanwhile, his comrades at the camp praise his courage in acting so promptly against the enemy, because it was very dark at night, and literally everyone was super sleepy, people were really tired, and no one really wanted to fight at the time. And so people were wow, you were super on point, you knew exactly what was happening. But Grayrock is yeah, I had no idea what direction I was even supposed to, I didn't even know if maybe I'd accidentally shot a actual army mate of mine. So the next day, he asked for permission to leave the camp to go search, claiming he just lost something, but it seems similarly fruitless. And after spending the day searching the area, he just ends up back at the tree and he decides to take a little nap. Now, during that time, he dreams about his childhood with his twin mother, from whom he was separable from, and their widowed mother. In a cage, their home was their Mockingbird, whose song seemed to hint at the possibilities of the world, of life, and love. But when the mom died, the family became divided, and the two brothers, William, or Private Greyrock, and then his twin brother John, went their separate ways. And John, or William, since they both were completely separate, and the people that took them in were enemies, they basically rarely talked after that. And William says that he can still hear the bird's melodious song in his memory. Now, when he wakes up from his dream, he heads back to the camp and spies a bird up upon the tree, which is implied it's like a mockingbird as well. And he starts crying. It just reminds him of his childhood mockingbird, which John ended up keeping, I believe. And right then and there, he finds the body of his twin brother, John, the man he had shot and killed that night before. William doesn't return to the army camp that night or ever again, and the implication being that he has basically deserted the army or most probably taken his own life. So this analysis of this was obviously a very incredible twist. I remember when I was reading about his dream, I was like, this is so useless. What is this telling us about the story? I don't understand at all. Until I got to the very end, and I was like, oh, I get it now. So the Mockingbird, like many of Ambrose Bierce's short stories, is set during the American Civil War, and like his other stories set during this time, the Mockingbird shows the human cost of war and the horrible reality of it. But there are a number of details in this story that are kind of ambiguous and leaves us, like William Greyrock himself, in the realm of conjecture, which is what he calls it. So I would say the best way to analyze Mockingbird then is just to view its rather melodramatic and unlikely plot as highly symbolic, not necessarily of war, but of the gulf between our youthful dreams and the rather grim hardships of life, and the chasm between illusion and reality. Mockingbird's song promises joy as well as access to the mysteries of life on love, quote-unquote, but this is a false promise. Indeed, the bird, which William sees when he wakes up from his dream, heralds the discovery of his twin's dead body. We might draw a parallel with the young boy's exposure to the horrors of war in Chickamauga, where he witnesses the aftermath of the battle, but only partly understands what's going on. But he's filled with fanciful ideas about the battle and carries a wooden sword with him. This happened in Chickamauga when he wanders off in search of adventure, but he too will find, quote unquote, the enchanted land to be anything but. The Mockingbird is basically just mocking him. Now, the realm of conjecture where William remains might be regarded as the childlike state of innocence or ambiguity and openness, or something akin to what John Keats called negative capability in a letter in 1817, as when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, and without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. Mockingbird is just an example of the story of the double, whereby William's twin brother represents his alter ego or alternative self. Poe has helped to kind of pioneer the story with tales like William Wilson, and Bierce, in making John Williams' identical twin brother, is summoning the idea that John is somehow more of William's brother, but also a version of himself. Basically, in the story, William, as he discovers the body of his twin, and we are told he finds himself gazing upon an quote-unquote image of himself, an ambiguous phrase which just means not just the likeness of himself, but also a reflection on who he really is or who he could have been. But that is it for today. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like to read next.